Good evening to everyone. I'm Venerable Adhimutti, the first New Zealand-born Bhikkhuni. And before I share the Dhamma Desana with you all, I just thought to begin by giving you a little bit of my meditation and monastic history. I did my first meditation retreat as a layperson at Dhammakota in Sri Lanka in 2004. And I stayed at Nilambe Buddhist Meditation Center for a while then too. After that, I went on to ordain in Thailand as a Mechi in 2005. Then as a seminary at Santi Forest Monastery in Australia in 2008, with Ayatotaloka as my preceptor and Bhante Sujato as my acharya. And then I ordained as a bhikkhuni in California in 2010. Ayatotaloka was my preceptor then, and Bhante Hinipola Gunaratana was the Owadakacharya. I'd like to mention the purpose of this desana, which is given from Hamilton, New Zealand, so we can know why we are giving this desana. The day when this Dhamma desana will be aired, the 10th of August 2021, is a day of many auspicious commemorations. August the 10th is the 5th anniversary of commencing operations at Aranya Bhikkhu Gimanhala at Bataramola. Aranya Gimanhala is a transit abode for both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis who are needing somewhere to stay while in Colombo. It's also a place where accommodations are offered for a bhikkhu or bhikkhuni to stay for a longer period if they need to due to ill health or while convalescing. The Aranya Gimanhala provides Sangha members with a place to stay and full support for keeping their Patimokkha precepts also, which is very much appreciated. My bhikkhuni mentor, Ayatotaloka, and myself stayed for a while in early 2019, and we were very grateful for the kindness and support that was shown to us while we were there. Today is also the first anniversary of the YouTube channel Along the Noble Path of the Aranya Gimanhala Charitable Trust. And also today is Mr. Kumar Punchiheva's 71st birthday, and it's also the anniversary of Mr. Kumar Punchiheva's wedding, which was on the 10th of August 1987. However, we regret that his late wife, Mrs. Damdara Punchiheva, is no more. So then today we wish for Mr. Kumar that he may continue to have all the necessities of life and to stay well and healthy and have all the material and spiritual support that will enable him to continue on his path towards Nibbana. And we wish for him the joy and happiness that comes from his generosity and from his many meritorious activities in his life, that this joy and happiness may support him on his Dhamma path. We wish for him every good blessing and the protection of the Devas and of the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha. I also wish to mention that the first substantially generous donation towards the New Zealand Bhikkhuni Sangha Trust was made in memory of the late Mrs. Damdara. So may she rejoice in this meritorious deed and rejoice also very much in seeing the establishment of the Bhikkhuni Sangha taking place in New Zealand. Since Mr. Kumar invited me to do this, I will just share a little bit of our vision here in New Zealand. So we are hoping to establish the Bhikkhuni Sangha in New Zealand, thus fulfilling the Lord Buddha's initial vision of the fourfold community. And we also aim to create an environment for both bhikkhunis and lay people to develop their meditation practice to a profound level. Currently, the New Zealand Bhikkhuni Sangha Trust is moving towards buying a residence and establishing a city centre where bhikkhunis can stay, teach, practice and study. And over time, we hope that to provide the opportunity for New Zealand women to train and ordain as bhikkhunis. Creating a city centre will allow us to reach out to our local community, provide Dhamma and meditation classes. As part of our Bhikkhuni residence, we plan to have a meditation hall and a reference library. And I should say there are also many, many books donated to our library in memory of Mrs. Damdara also. And so this library will provide a place where people can read and research and hold Dhamma gatherings and discussion groups. So this is the first step towards our larger vision of establishing a Bhikkhuni hermitage in the countryside for Bhikkhunis and serious lay practitioners who wish to undertake long-term secluded retreat time. We also wish to preserve and encourage the depth and breadth of concentration and wisdom practices available in the Theravada tradition. So a guiding principle is to preserve a tradition that is wide as the sky, deep as the ocean, and as finely grained as the sand on the seashore. We will be very grateful for any further donations towards our library and also towards our residents that anyone might be inspired to make. So I wish to thank Mr. Kurma Punchiheva for inviting me to give this Dhamma Desana and for asking me to share a little bit about our project to establish the Bhikkhuni Sangha here in New Zealand. So I will now begin the Dhamma Desana with the Namo Tassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Okay, so today's Dhamma talk is on the Dvaidavitaka Sutta. Thus have I heard, on one occasion the Blessed One was living at Sawati in Jeta's Grove, Anata Pindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied. The Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, before my enlightenment, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, suppose that I divide my thoughts into two classes. Then I set on one side thoughts of sensual desire, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty, and I set on the other side thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of non-cruelty. So here we see the Bodhisattva doing two things. The first is that he is stepping back and observing the contents of his mind. And the second is that he is discerning the difference between unwholesome states of mind and wholesome states of mind. So this ability to be able to step back and observe the mind is a fundamental first step in working with the mind. Because to skillfully work with the mind, we need to understand the mind. And to understand the mind, we need to observe it. And so this, of course, is not completely straightforward at the beginning of our practice. Until we've trained ourselves, then most of us just spend our time lost in thought. I actually remember during my very first Goenka retreat in Sri Lanka, I saw for the first time the degree to which I was just lost in, just fantasies and thinking. I remember looking around at everyone who was with me on that retreat and just realizing that each of us was just sitting there in our kind of own private thought bubble, that we were just plugged into our own virtual world of delusion. And I'd never really noticed that before. And then a while later, I went on an extended retreat in Thailand, and I started to develop the capacity to see my thoughts the moment that they arose, and also develop the capacity or the ability not to follow these thoughts and not to follow my emotions, but just to let them go and come back into the present moment. Then I remember later on I went on holiday with my family for a while, and I wasn't really practicing. And so then I remember again just being lost in thought, and I had enough awareness to know I was completely lost, but my mind had lost the strength to be able to do anything about it. And I remember thinking, my goodness, this is just really suffering, just being at the mercy of my mind and being at the mercy of my emotions. It's just no fun at all. So this ability to be able to stand back from our minds and our emotions and to observe them is an extremely valuable skill that we develop when we practice meditation. Because generally we are thinking, but we're not even aware that we're thinking. We feel emotions and we just completely identify with whatever emotions we happen to feel. So we are the happiness, or we are the sadness, or we are the fear. But the reality is that our thoughts and emotions are just conditioned phenomena that arise in our minds, stay for a while, and then disappear. So in order to develop some capacity to observe the mind, then a certain amount of daily meditation practice is really necessary. Maybe at least 20 or 30 minutes a day, because it takes a while for the mind to settle and us to be able to see it, to get beyond the surface waves of the water. And also just the discipline of the practice when we bring our mind back to our object again and again develops like a strength in the mind and a certain flexibility of mind that gives us the ability to step away from our thoughts and observe them. Of course, the amount of time that most people have to spend in formal meditation is limited, and so it's really important to use other ways as well to develop this capacity of observation. So basically, this is basic mindfulness practice. So to develop our mindfulness or the quality of presence that we bring to whatever we are doing, we can take simple daily actions such as brushing our teeth or drinking our morning coffee and just develop the habit to be fully with whatever we're doing. So just to be completely with the action, to feel the movements, just to be in the moment. And if our minds rush in with their kind of thoughts and ideas about what we're doing, then just as a meditation, we just let go of all that mental chatter and return wordlessly to whatever we're doing in the moment. So in this way, over time, we can train ourselves to actually experience what it's like to be in this very moment as it occurs, rather than experiencing our lives kind of once removed. So we're always often seeing our life through our thoughts and comparisons and judgments about what is happening, rather than experiencing what is happening as it unfolds. I remember once I went to Thailand and I met this very great monk, Ajahn Ganha, who is the nephew of Ajahn Chah. And he instructed me that whatever I did, I should train myself to do that activity in order to cultivate my mind, not in order to get the job done. So for example, if I was cleaning my room, I should clean my room to develop my mindfulness. But if I tidied my room in order to have a tidy room, he told me that the defilements would just burn in my heart. Also, the Vietnamese Zen master, Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, writes in a similar vein about the benefits, for example, of washing the dishes to wash the dishes. So he says, not to wash dishes in order to get clean dishes, but by washing dishes just for the sake of washing dishes, we get clean dishes anyway. And by really giving our full attention to, say, washing the dishes, we train our minds to stay fully with the activity that we are doing. So we can be conscious that we're standing at the sink. We can feel our hand reaching out to pick up the dish. We can feel the warmth of the water on our hands. We can feel the soap suds, the movement of our hand as it washes the dishes. And we can just be completely attentive to what we're doing in that moment. And by giving our full attention to the activity that we're performing in that moment, we really come into the present and we become very centered. So this is really not that difficult for any of us to do. It's just that we need to remember. So right now, if I ask everyone who's watching this to be aware of your body, then it's very easy. The mind just steps back and it is aware of the body. But we're just in the habit of being lost. And so, our challenge is just to create a new habit of remembering to bring our full attention and bring our full awareness to everything we do. And over time, we develop more and more of a habit of being aware of our various activities. So the Buddha taught 4 levels, basic levels of mindfulness, starting from using objects that are very easy for us and very obvious for us to feel, to more subtle ones. And so the first foundation of mindfulness, as you probably all know, is staying with the physical, because physical is very obvious to us. So the Buddha gave us very kind of simple or fundamental instructions that when we are sitting, we are to know we are sitting. When we are standing, we should know we are standing. When we are walking, that we should know we are walking. And when we are lying down, we should know that we are lying down. Because often the case is we might be sitting or walking or lying down, but we're totally unaware of our bodies. So over time, we can train ourselves to be aware of our bodies, our posture, and whatever the body is doing in the moment. So this isn't thinking about our body, but it's just being aware of what it's doing, of what it's feeling, like a kind of wordless knowing and experiencing. So if we can do that, then we are present. So this is a very skillful way to bring us into the present moment. We can also bring our attention to our breathing. This is another part of awareness of the body, the first foundation of mindfulness. And any time during the day, we can bring our attention to the inhalation and to the exhalation of the breath. We don't breathe in the past, we don't breathe in the future, we just breathe now. So breathing is always with us. And the other nice thing about our breathing is it's very closely related to our state of mind. So depending on our emotions, depending on whether we're sad, whether we're happy, whether we're anxious, whether we're peaceful, whether we're fearful, or whatever our emotional state is, our breathing changes. And by breathing, bringing our attention to our breathing, by staying with our breathing, by maybe deliberately lengthening our exhale a little bit, we can really calm ourselves down and bring ourselves into the present moment. So this is an exercise we can do whenever we think of it, just bringing our mind to our breath for a few minutes and settle and clear our minds. So as we learn to stabilize our attention through our daily meditation practice and through the practice of mindfulness, we gradually become more and more aware of the activities of our minds. When our awareness becomes more and more anchored in our body, we are able to observe, we kind of have a place to stand in a way and observe our thoughts and emotions without being swept away by them and without becoming so identified with them. And we start to kind of understand the mind more and more. We start to see how our emotions influence our thoughts and how our thoughts influence our emotions, and we just start to understand how the thinking mind works. Now to come back to the sutta that we are studying, the Bodhisattva is sitting, observing his thoughts, and it occurs to him, suppose that I divide my thoughts into two classes. Then I set on one side thoughts of sensual desire, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty, and I set on the other side thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of non-cruelty. So here we see a fundamental, the articulation of a fundamental aspect of the development of wisdom in the early Buddhist tradition, which is this ability to discern between kusala and akusala states of mind, or beneficial and unbeneficial, or wholesome and unwholesome mind states. So I wanted to share some ways that can be quite useful for recognizing wholesome and unwholesome states of mind as they arise, that I've found really helpful for myself. And just to say here, I'm drawing a little bit from Dr. Rick Hanson's work. So one way that we can recognize a state of mind as wholesome or unwholesome is by seeing, for example, whether the quality of our mind is balanced and kind of responsive, or whether our mind is disturbed and reactive. So like being on the lookout for this inner sense of like fullness, peacefulness and balance, or whether our inner state is one of deficit and disturbance and kind of we feel imbalanced. So this is one good way for us to kind of notice whether our state of mind is wholesome or unwholesome. We can also kind of be aware of the kinds of situations that bring up different types of wholesome and unwholesome responses in us. So for example, those states such as aversion, fear, anxiety, and panic tend to arise when our needs for physical safety are challenged in some way. When we are safe and well protected, then we tend to default to an inner state of peacefulness and balance. Lopa or greedy states such as frustration, disappointment, a feeling of lack are these kinds of states which tend to push us to grasp at our experience, often arise when our needs for satisfaction and reward are challenged in some way. So maybe we're finding it difficult to get enough food for our family, or we can't accomplish our goals, and then we often feel kind of frustrated and lacking in some way. But when we have what we need and feel fulfilled in terms of our aspirations in life, then we tend to default to an inner state of contentment. And then we have states that arise that are connected to the Brahmaviharas, the far and near enemies of the Brahmaviharas. So for example, when the connections and our relationships with others are threatened in some way, then we can feel lonely or rejected or ashamed or resentful. But when we have a healthy sense of relatedness to others in terms of being surrounded by good friends, people who love us and care for us, then we tend to feel a sense of love in our hearts. And by love here I mean metta or loving kindness. So as spiritual practitioners, our challenge is to learn how to maintain wholesome states of mind even in situations that we might find challenging and that might normally provoke our defilements. So for example, when there are challenges to our physical safety, are we able to maintain a sense of like calm strength and maybe respond to the situation in a wise and balanced way? Or do we tend to go into states of anger, anxiety, worry and panic? In terms of challenges to our satisfaction, when we are able to increasingly cultivate within ourselves a sense of contentment, gratitude, gladness, a sense of the richness of the present moment that is arising now, and thankfulness for the many blessings we have already in our lives, then even if sometimes we're challenged in terms of meeting our goals and our material well-being is not what we would like it to be, we might be able to respond to these challenges from a greater sense of inner balance, in a sense that, our life is very full already. In terms of our need for connection with others, the more we're able to cultivate a warm heart, the more we're able to be loving and generous and supportive to others, and the more we can cultivate an internal sense of self-worth, of caring and metta for ourselves, then the more we're able to respond in a wise and balanced way to difficulties that inevitably arise in our relationships with others. If we already have a heart full of love, we're not so kind of knocked off balance, and we don't have so much hurt and heartache when the inevitable conflicts of life arise. So having cultivated our minds, of course, we're still human and we'll still be impacted by unpleasant feelings that arise when difficult things happen in our lives. So we still feel the first arrows of experience, but we learn not to add second arrows, right? The second arrows of reactivity. So we can increasingly learn to respond from a place of fullness and balance, and not to react from an inner state of deficit and disturbance to the difficulties in our lives. So we learn over time to maintain kusala, wholesome and beneficial states of mind that are not so dependent on our external circumstances. And one more important point to add here is that unpleasant feelings tend to signal that our needs for safety are being challenged and tend to provoke dosa-like states of fear or anger or whatever. Pleasant experiences tend to signal an opportunity for us to satisfy ourselves, or a challenge if we are unable to get the pleasant object we desire. And with reference to our need for a relationship, we tend to feel hurt and heartache when something goes wrong. And so an important part of our practice is maintaining an inner equilibrium even when these difficult feelings arise. And so these different vedana or feelings might arise within our experience, but they do not invade our mind and remain. As in the Mahasakkacha Sutta, the Blessed One said, how is one undeveloped in body and undeveloped in mind? There is the case where a pleasant feeling arises in an uneducated, run-of-the-mill person. On being touched by the pleasant feeling, he becomes impassioned with pleasure and is reduced to being impassioned with pleasure. His pleasant feeling ceases. With the cessation of the pleasant feeling, there arises a painful feeling. On being touched with the painful feeling, he sorrows, grieves, and laments. Beats his breast, becomes distraught. When that pleasant feeling had arisen in him, it invaded his mind and remained, because of his lack of development of the body. When that painful feeling had arisen in him, it invaded his mind and remained, because of his lack of development of the mind. This is how one is undeveloped in body and undeveloped in mind. And how is one developed in body and developed in mind? There is the case where a pleasant feeling arises in a well-educated disciple of the Noble Ones. On being touched by the pleasant feeling, he doesn't become impassioned with pleasure and is not reduced to being impassioned with pleasure. His pleasant feeling ceases. With the cessation of the pleasant feeling, there arises a painful feeling. On being touched with the painful feeling, he doesn't sorrow, grieve, or lament, beat his breast, or become distraught. When that pleasant feeling had arisen in him, it didn't invade his mind and remain, because of his development of the body. When that painful feeling had arisen in him, it didn't invade his mind and remain, because of his development of the mind. This is how one is developed in body and developed in mind. So now to continue with another verse from the Dvaitaka Sutta, the Buddha says, Bhikkhus, whatever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of his mind. If he frequently thinks and ponders upon thoughts of renunciation, he has abandoned the thought of sensual desire to cultivate the thought of renunciation. And when his mind inclines to thoughts of renunciation. And this section then continues in the same way with thoughts of non-ill will and thoughts of non-cruelty. So basically we need to be really careful about what we think about, because what we frequently think and ponder upon, these things will become the inclination of our mind. Or in our modern terminology, the mind takes the shape of what it rests upon. So the more we are able to notice wholesome states of mind when they arise and to rest in them, the more we will strengthen these qualities as the underlying tendencies of our minds. So for example, someone may do something that is really kind to us. They may say something encouraging, they may smile at us, they may offer to help us out. And when this happens, often a subtle feeling of warmth and appreciation may arise in our heart. So if we can notice this warmth arising in our hearts and maintain this feeling in our heart for a few seconds, kind of soak our mind in it for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds at a time, maybe spread this feeling throughout our body. In this way, we are strengthening and reinforcing that wholesome state of appreciation and love in our heart. And we can do this same thing for any positive state that we might experience. So we could do this for experiences of compassion, or experience of confidence, or experiences of being cared about by another. And we can take these opportunities to reinforce these qualities, these positive qualities, many times a day. So the more we cultivate these beneficial qualities, the stronger our underlying inclinations towards these beneficial qualities becomes. And then the stronger the positive underlying tendencies are in our mind, the more likely these positive states are to arise, which then gives us more opportunity to rest in them, to cultivate them, and further strengthen them. And so it kind of becomes a virtuous cycle. So in this way, if we're very careful about where we put our attention, and we really take care to place our attention on what is wholesome, what is beneficial, this will really help us to be able to shift our underlying, kind of often unconscious dispositions, inclinations, and tendencies in a positive direction. And also, if we know we have a particular weakness, like a particular unwholesome inclination in our mind, then we can take many opportunities each day to reverse that tendency. So, for example, we may tend to be impatient or frustrated, or often we might find ourselves anxious or worried, for example. And in these cases, it's important to allow our minds to rest as much as possible in the opposite wholesome states. So, for example, if we have a tendency to feel frustrated by things and to feel disappointed with people, or to feel some kind of lack or sense of impoverishment in regard to our material possessions, then we need to look for times when we feel an inner sense of contentment and gratitude, and purposely cultivate these states. So there's many things we could do. We could have a daily kind of exercise of bringing to mind people who have been our benefactors, and bring up our gratitude towards them in our hearts, and really strengthen that feeling in our hearts, and keep it going for as long as we can, and really soak our mind in it. And as a daily exercise, we could think about the many things that we do have in our lives. You know, that we have enough food, that we have water, that we have shelter, and really cultivate an inner feeling of gratitude that we soak our minds in for like 10, 20 or 30 seconds. So in this way we can develop the habit of looking for things that we feel glad and grateful for. And we can notice times when we might feel a natural sense of contentment during the day, and or we just feel at ease. And we can dwell in these feelings of gratitude, contentment, or inner peace. So then slowly over time, by prolonging and dwelling in these states of contentment, gratitude, and gladness, we start to develop the character trait of contentment, gratitude, and gladness. And we reduce or kind of reverse the character trait and the underlying feelings that we were experiencing before of like greed, frustration, and lack. And so day by day, by being careful, we rest our minds. And by dwelling in wholesome mind states, we can hardwire these experiences into our minds, and we can increasingly tilt our minds in a more wholesome direction. So in the Dhammapada there is a verse, think not lightly of good, saying it will not come to me. Drop by drop is the water pot filled. Likewise the wise one, gathering it little by little, fills himself with good. So we should ourselves, at any opportunity we have, gather into ourselves and fill ourselves up with any goodness that we can. In relation to cultivating new states within ourselves, of course we need to be patient and persistent, and to realize that it just takes time. So one model of the learning process is that there are kind of 4 stages. The first stage is unconscious incompetence. The second stage is conscious incompetence. The third stage is conscious competence. And the fourth stage is unconscious competence. So for example, when we start out, we have some kind of negative tendency or behavior, and we don't even know that we have it. We're not even aware. So we just keep on, behaving as we always have. We just keep on repeating it. So maybe, for example, we have a tendency to be impatient and speedy with others, and we're not even aware that this is the case. In the second stage, so that would be unconscious incompetence. So in the second stage, which is conscious incompetence, maybe people give us feedback, and we realize that we have this tendency towards impatience, and so now we're not happy with ourselves about this, and we want to change it. But unfortunately for us, there's this really strong momentum of past conditioning and habit, and even though we don't want to be impatient anymore, we still are. So we're aware of being impatient, we don't want to be impatient, but we're still impatient. And then in the third stage, which is the stage of conscious competence, the tendency towards being impatient still arises, and we're aware of it arising, but we no longer act on it. So something might happen when we normally react in an impatient way, and then maybe we feel the sensation of impatience and frustration arising in our bodies, but we're able just to relax, to feel the sensations in our body rise and pass away, and just to kind of have an inner sense of peace and acceptance about the situation that we stay with. So that's conscious competence. And then in stage 4, our impatient tendency just doesn't arise as much anymore. So situations that used to really aggravate us or irritate us, they're just no longer a problem. We're able to keep our inner peacefulness and ease in a wide spectrum of experiences. So then these are like the 4 stages of learning a new skill. Unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence. So the most difficult stage is obviously the second stage, when we're really aware of our failings, but we're unable to do anything about them. So the important thing at that stage is just to hang in there, just to keep persevering, and eventually we'll make progress. So this means at the beginning, if there's a beneficial trait that we're trying to grow in ourselves, we need to be quite intentional about drawing on that and pulling up that trait to use it in the moment. But with practice, with time, the good trait just starts arising automatically. And at that point, we've just moved into the stage 4 of unconscious competence. So, of course, developing our mindfulness in daily activities, we develop more and more awareness of the habitual responses that arise in our minds. And we develop more and more ability to see the unwholesome tendencies coming up in our minds and not to follow them. And we develop a greater ability to see the wholesome tendencies that arise in our minds and to strengthen them. So we can increase the gap in our experiences and we can increase the gap between stimulus and response. So when an experience happens, we're more able to choose what way we will respond to it. So we gain greater freedom. So rather than just being on autopilots and automatically reacting to whatever happens to us. Okay, so now to come back to the Dwai Dawitaka Sutta again. As we've said a few times, before the Buddha's enlightenment, it occurred to him that he could divide his thoughts into 2 categories. So he said on one side, the thoughts of sensual desire, the thoughts of ill will, and the thoughts of cruelty. So basically the unwholesome, unbeneficial states, the akusala states. And he said on the other side, thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, and thoughts of non-cruelty. So this is a basic distinction then, to be able to discern and recognize which states are arising in our minds are wholesome and which states are unwholesome. And so the Buddha, before his enlightenment, sat practicing, diligent, ardent, and resolute. And the Buddha also, before his enlightenment, had unwholesome thoughts arise in him, connected with sensual desire, connected with ill will, and with cruelty. And when these thoughts arose in him, he was mindful enough to know what he was thinking, and he also reflected on the nature of his thoughts. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of sensual desire arose in me. I understood thus: this thought of sensual desire has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction, to others' affliction, and to the affliction of both. It obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana. When I considered this leads to my own affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to others' affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to the affliction of both, it subsided in me. When I considered this obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana, it subsided in me. Whenever a thought of sensual desire arose in me, I abandoned it, removed it, and did away with it. And then the sutta repeats the same pattern for thoughts of ill will and thoughts of cruelty. So we've already covered the necessity of distinguishing between wholesome and unwholesome states that arise in the mind. But an interesting detail that the Bodhisattva adds here is taking the time to really reflect on the danger found in these unwholesome states. The fact that these thoughts create harm for ourselves, harm for others, obstruct wisdom, and prevent us from reaching our highest aspirations. So adding a brief reflection like this can add a lot of power to the way that we meet unwholesome states. So an example of this would be that maybe we are angry and we're tempted to act out that anger. But we can maybe bring to mind what happened last time we acted out of anger, how ashamed and remorseful we felt afterwards, and the damage that this did to our relationships. So by reflecting like this, we'll be very quickly able to undercut any impulse we might have in that moment to lose our temper or to do something we regret. Another important point here is that the Bodhisattva in this verse is very clear about his aspiration to realize Nibbana. He's very clear about his commitment to complete and total awakening. So in the context of this commitment, he sees that any defilements arising in his mind would just lead him away from his goal. So this clear commitment gives him the energy and clarity that he needs to abandon, remove, and do away with any defilements that arose in his mind. And so for us also, sometimes it's very, very helpful when there's different states in our mind that are difficult to really remember our deeper commitment and aspirations, so we can bring up the motivation and the energy to do away with unwholesome states that obstruct us and to cultivate the wholesome states that will take us closer to our goal. And in regard to guarding his mind from unwholesome states, the Buddha uses the following simile. Just in the last month of the rainy season, in the autumn, when the crops thicken, a cowherd would guard his cows by constantly tapping and poking them on this side and that with a stick to check and curb them. Why is that? Because he sees that he could be flogged, imprisoned, fined, and blamed if he let them stray into the crops. So too, I saw in unwholesome states danger, degradation, and defilement, and in wholesome states the blessing of renunciation, the aspect of cleansing. So when the crops are thick and have not yet been harvested, when they're ripe, they're very tempting to cows. And so during that time, the cowherd has to be vigilant, poking and prodding them with a stick to stop them from straying into the fields, because if he lets his cows go into the fields, he'll be fined and punished. So it can be the same with our minds, right? If we are around something that we know triggers our sensual desire, or if we're in a situation that tends to trigger our aversive tendencies, then we know we need to really, really guard our minds. We need to be right there, very alert and vigilant. And we need to take a lot of care to stop our minds from going into places that will lead to our suffering or into the suffering of others. We really need to be careful to stop our mind from grazing on the defilements. So when we're tired or when we're in a place that's vulnerable to our particular set of defilements, we really need to be on our guard. Sometimes we know our defilements are just right there, and the temptation is very strong to act on them or to speak from them. So we need to be very vigilant in these situations. Now there was also a time before his enlightenment when the Buddha looked at his mind, and he recognized that when he was meditating, diligent, ardent, and resolute, that the thoughts that arose were about renunciation, they were about non-ill will, and they were about non-cruelty. They did not cause affliction to himself and to others. They did not obstruct wisdom. They did not cause difficulties, and they led to Nibbana. And then he uses a different image to describe his relationship to the wholesome states in his mind. Just as in the last month of the hot season, when all the crops have been brought inside the villages, a cowherd would guard his cows while staying at the root of a tree or else in the open, since he needs only to be mindful that the cows are there. So too there was need for me only to be mindful that those states were there. So during the last month in the hot season, the crops have been harvested, so the cows aren't going to be tempted by the crops. So basically, during that time, there's no danger, so the cowherd goes and sits under the tree and just watches the cows. And so in the same way, when our minds are basically wholesome, we can go and sit under the shade of a tree and just recognize those mind states that are there. We don't need to do very much with our mind at this time because there's really no danger and no trouble. We can trust our minds during these times because we can see that our intentions and our thoughts are good. But the discourse goes even further than that and suggests that even though there's no problem with those thoughts, the Buddha realized that if he continued to think and ponder upon those thoughts, then his mind and body would be tired and strained, and he would be far from concentration. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of non-will arose in me, a thought of renunciation arose in me, a thought of non-cruelty arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of non-cruelty has arisen in me. This does not lead to my own affliction or to others' affliction, or to the affliction of both. It aids wisdom, does not cause difficulties, and leads to nibbana. If I think and ponder upon this thought, even for a night, even for a day, even for a night and day, I see nothing to fear from it. But with excessive thinking and pondering, I might tire my body. And when the body is tired, the mind becomes strained. And when the mind is strained, it is far from concentration. So I steadied my mind internally, quieted it, brought it to singleness, and concentrated it. Why is that? So my mind should not be strained. Tireless energy was aroused in me, and unremitting mindfulness was established. My body was tranquil and untroubled, my mind concentrated and unified. Quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, I entered upon and abided in the first jhana. And then I'm skipping quite a lot here. And it goes to, I directly knew birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what has been done, what has to be done has been done, and there is no coming into any state of being. This was the third knowledge attained by me in the last watch of the night. Ignorance was banished, and true knowledge arose. Darkness was banished, and light arose, as happens in one who abides diligent, ardent, and resolute. So the Buddha understood that if he allowed even good thoughts to settle, then the concentration can deepen. And as the concentration deepens, the concentrated mind becomes a support for insight. So in his own practice, the Buddha was seeking something beyond just the ease of wholesome states. He was seeking liberation, and that is the path that he taught. So after the Buddha sat down and cleared his mind of his thoughts, he developed concentration, and when he emerged from the concentration, he turned his mind to the three knowledges to understand the workings of causes and conditions. And he liberated his mind from the taints, the fetters, and from the forces that bound him to the cycle of suffering. So after that, at the end of the sutta, he uses the simile of the deer and describes the path that the deer travel as being the path that one travels joyfully, and the path is described as the eightfold path. Suppose, bhikkhus, that in a wooded range there was a great low-lying marsh near which a large herd of deer lived. But another man came, desiring their good, welfare and protection, and he reopened the safe and good path that led to their happiness, and he closed off the false path, and he removed the decoy and destroyed the dummy, so that the large herd of deer might later come to growth, increase and fulfillment. That man, desiring their good, welfare and protection, is a term for the Tathagata, accomplished and fully enlightened. The safe and good path is to be travelled joyfully is a term for the noble eightfold path. That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness and right concentration. So, bhikkhus, the safe and good path to be travelled joyfully has been reopened by me. The wrong path has been closed off, the decoy removed, the dummy destroyed. What should be done for his disciples out of compassion by a teacher who seeks their welfare and has compassion for them, that I have done for you, bhikkhus. There are these roots of trees, empty huts. Meditate, bhikkhus, do not delay. or else you will regret it later. That is our instruction for you. This is what the Blessed One said. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So we finish here with the path, which is to be travelled joyfully. So let us joyfully practice the path, joyfully cultivate our minds, and let joy inform our own development and our own path. Okay, so we now dedicate merit to the Devas and to Mrs. Damdara Punchiheva, and also to all the departed parents and friends and relatives of both Kumar Punchiheva and also of the late Mrs. Damdara Punchiheva, and also for all other friends and relations who have departed from us during our long samsaric journey. So we can keep in mind those people for the dedication of merit. May they have a good rebirth. May it be a happy rebirth, a fortunate rebirth, where they can take the triple refuge, take the 5 precepts and practice Buddhism again. And also a dedication of blessings for Mr. Kumar Punchiheva on the occasion of his birthday. So if you'd like to join in, you're welcome to, with the chanting and the dedication of merit and the dedication of blessings. Itavata ca mehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe deva namodantu sabba sampati siddhya Itavata ca mehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe bhuta namodantu sabba sampati siddhya Itavata ca mehi sampadang punya sampadang Sabbe satana modantu sabba sampati siddhya Akasata ca bhumata deva naga mahindika Punyang tang anamoditva chirang rakantu sasanang Akasata ca bhumata deva naga mahindika Punyang tang anamoditva chirang rakantu desanang Akasata ca bhumata deva naga mahindika Punyang tang anamoditva chirang rakantu tvang sada Idang punyatinang hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo Idang punyatinang hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo Idang punyatinang hotu sukhita hontu nyatayo. May you abide in well-being, in freedom from affliction, in freedom from hostility, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may you maintain well-being in yourself. And now just to finish with a final chant. Abhivadana sili sanichang Buddha pachayino Chattaro Dhamma vadanti ayuano sukhang balang Ayurarogya sampati saga sampate mevacha Ato nibbana sampati minate samijatu Sukhihotu supatweva nirogya veva pinsuru veva. Thank you for watching this. And I think this is an offering we can make of ping or merit for happiness and the well-being of Mr. Koma Punchihewa. So thank you for the invitation, Puma Mahatea, to give this desana. Thank you very much. Te Arawan Sarana.